This is a Zoom webinar. All attendees are muted with the exception of the panelists. Panelists include myself, our student team, our Pritzker Center directors and speakers, Leslie Heimoff and Stacey Barron. We are taking questions throughout the talk. Please utilize the Q&A function on Zoom for questions or ask the Spanish moderator. We will respond during the talk or ask the speakers to do so. If we run short on time, we will respond after the talk. This talk will be immediately available on our UCLA Pritzker Center page on Facebook and will be posted on our YouTube channel and Twitter account at UCLA Pritzker within 72 hours. If you didn't RSVP and would like future resources, please add your name and email to the chat. We will add you to our list. Finally, this talk is largely based on Los Angeles and our foster care system here. However, we understand that there are callers joining us from across the country at this time, and we will do our best to share resources and insights that are relevant to all foster care systems across the country. Now for some introductions. On behalf of the UCLA Pritzker Center, my name is Taylor Dudley. I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth installment of our community speaker series on COVID-19. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Leslie Heimoff, an attorney and the executive director of Children's Law Center of California, and Dr. Stacey Barron, a pediatrician and assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at Olive View UCLA Medical Center. Thank you both for being here. Let's turn to our first question. Leslie and Stacey, can you please give us a little bit of background on yourselves and your work?
Sure. Who do you want to go first?
Let's go first.
Okay, I'll go. So thank you for the introduction and for hosting us today, Taylor. So as Taylor mentioned, I'm an attorney. I'm the executive director at Children's Law Center of California. I have been with CLC for 28 and some odd years. Prior to joining CLC as a staff attorney, I was a social worker of sorts. I ran a group home for teenage boys for a number of years, and it was that experience that led me to law school. And I went to law school specifically to work with young people. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to realize that dream at Children's Law Center all of these years. CLC, as some of you will know, is a private nonprofit legal services organization, and we represent every child in the foster care system in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and Placer counties here in California. We're also involved in quite a bit of policy work, both locally at the state level and nationally. And within those three counties that I mentioned, we represent approximately 33,000 children. So we spend a great deal of time hearing from young people and families, and all of our advocacy is guided by those experiences. And I think that's good for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Stacey?
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Taylor. Hi, everyone. My name's Stacey Barron. As Taylor mentioned, I'm an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at UCLA in the Department of Pediatrics. I completed my residency and chief residency here at UCLA, and I actually had my residency continuity clinic at Olive View, which is now my work medical home. Leslie, your story about getting into law school struck a chord with me because I recently reread my medical school application, and in it, the reason I wanted to go to medical school was because of an experience working with medically complex children in the foster care system in Atlanta. So I also feel similar that we are sort of living out those dreams that we had set going into our careers, which is really special. In my admin time at Olive View, I lead our department in QI initiatives, but actually the majority of my time is spent clinically as a primary pediatrician at the Olive View UCLA Hub Clinic, where I treat DCFS-involved children and families. For those on the call who are not familiar with the Hub clinics, Hub is not an acronym, but rather a concept. So the patient is the hub of a wheel. We are a multidisciplinary network of clinics in the county that take care of DCFS-involved families. I always tell my patients, you're not just here or over the phone to hear or see me, but we have a lot of other team members that are working to keep your family healthy. We work with case management, social work, public health, mental health. And I also just want to extend a thanks to my fearless leaders, Dr. Shannon Tyne and Dr. Joe Rojas, for really helping us at Olive View navigate these uncharted waters of COVID-19. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you both. Leslie, can you please describe some of the unique issues children and families involved with foster care are facing at this time?
Sure, thank you. So I think first and foremost, what distinguishes children and families involved in the child welfare system from the rest of us is that they have no ability to make their own decisions. They cannot, most of us are absorbing lots from the media and from the Department of Public Health and the CDC and making decisions about how the COVID pandemic is affecting us and what precautions we need to take, how we're changing our lives in order to do our part to flatten the curve, but also to keep our own families safe and whole and to deal with the anxiety that is caused by this situation. But our clients don't have that freedom and they don't have that liberty. And they are relying on a whole host of people, everyone from their social worker to their foster parent, to their case manager, to their judge, to their attorney. And all of those individuals are making decisions based in part by the law and by various guidelines and regulations, but frankly, also in part by their own personal perspective on COVID. So you may have 1 to 2 families in the same situation who have different instructions from the legal and child welfare system based on whoever happens to be their social worker, their lawyer, or their judge. So they're in a situation where they are, they were already in a situation where they had lost control of their own lives. And now that's compounded by COVID. And similarly, because they are, and so because of that, they're subject to different rules. Early on, as many people know, and actually still ongoing in some parts of the country, courts have issued orders terminating or suspending all in-person contact for children who are in foster care and their parents, for example, or their siblings if they're placed separately, or their extended family. I don't have that rule on me. I have a guideline that tells me I shouldn't be with more than 5 unrelated people at a time, but I can still choose to walk down my street, have a conversation from across the way with my neighbor. Many people chose to have their adult children or young adult children come home, leave when they left their college dorms, they came home to their parents' homes. Kids in foster care are not given that option. So the compounding of the separation that was already going on for them is so much worse now. They're already separated from their family, which might have been their only link to their community, to their family. That 1 time a week visit might have been their only link, and now that may have been taken away. So we're very concerned about them being re-traumatized, about their trauma being heightened and further impacted by the situation. For non-minor dependents in particular, which are older youth, 18, 19, and 20 years old, many of whom are living on their own or were in a college dorm, they don't have a family to fall back on in the way that other young adults might have. So their immediate crisis may also be much more heightened than another 17, 18, 19, or 20-year-old. Losing their job may mean losing their housing and losing their way to feed themselves as well. It might even, and being, having their college campus closed down might have also been the only way they had Wi-Fi. So something as simple as access to Wi-Fi, which we're all relying on now, right? The answer to everything during COVID seems to be teledoc, telehealth, teleclassroom, everything is online. And if you don't have access to Wi-Fi, you're cut off even more. So the isolation factor is very profound. And I guess lastly, I would say to sort of sum it all up, for many of our families, their life has literally been put on hold in very profound ways, much more profound than those of us who are living on our own and making our own decisions, because decisions, for example, about children being reunified or moving into permanency by having adoption finalized are all put on hold. So the fact that so much has been put on hold has a profound impact in much more dramatic ways than it might for the rest of us or for much of the community.
Thank you, Leslie. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but would love to hear from Stacey, Dr. Barron, about what you're seeing from a medical side that's unique to kids in foster care during this time.
Yeah, thank you. And Leslie, I echo much of what you said and have patient experiences literally last week and this morning that really kind of make that point. I guess I want to start just with the issue around visitation, and then I'll go into some other medical needs. I know this change in visitation was a really big decision that was not taken lightly, and I think this is coming from the communicable disease pandemic perspective and the public health lens needed to flatten the curve. I think we need to recognize that the decisions around visitation most certainly have downstream consequences for youth, parents, caregivers, and that is something that we need to address moving forward. I think from a health perspective, one thing that's so unique about this virus is that 2 days prior to showing symptoms, people are shedding this virus and people are contagious. And so the normal precautions of screening for sick symptoms is not necessarily sufficient in terms of protecting others from the spread. And that is really the root of the social distancing recommendation. And I think this change in visitation, this lack of control that these families have in this time is paralyzing and definitely has things that we're going to need to deal with as this continues. From a medical perspective, I wanted to touch a little bit on the fact that we know that youth in foster care have more mental health comorbidities than the general population. And this COVID pandemic, and I will talk about this later, has really delayed and can delay some health needs. And so for this population, we have unmet health needs that are postponed yet again. So maybe that eye appointment or the sleep study or the much needed dental procedure that's not considered an essential service, but is in a delay upon an existing delay secondary to that background of neglect. And in addition, because our patients have sometimes changed placements multiple times, all of these different appointments can sometimes be difficult to keep up with during a normal time, and so this makes that all the more challenging. I echo what Leslie was saying about the transitional age youth. I think so much of this impacts them really uniquely. I'll talk first about our reliance on telehealth and telemedicine. Doing a phone call with an adolescent who doesn't have a private space to talk to you about sensitive issues is even more significant in this population because our youth have such profound privacy concerns to begin with. And so setting the tone for the visit, which we're able to do in person, and letting them know the privacy is so helpful. And over telehealth, telemedicine, that can be difficult when they're in a very close space with others to really see how are they doing with their placement, with their school, with their mental health, with their sexual and reproductive health. So I think that is a difficulty in that population. And I think just as Leslie said, I just saw youth last week that had our transitional age, had gained employment, they were paying rent, they were supporting themselves, and they lost their jobs secondary to COVID. And this is just another trauma upon trauma in their history and really difficult for them given the background in which they came. I have numerous other concerns coming from families. I'll share additional ones that came up in the time that I've been in clinic, which is there are children in new placements who were already adjusting to new schools, and now they're adjusting to a new type of learning at their new school. Many also have a background of developmental issues, perhaps from in utero substance exposure, or trauma. They may have ADHD, which is really difficult to control at home and engage in the online curriculum. And kinship caregivers or foster caregivers or parents may be experiencing their own new stress of financial and job insecurity while also trying to play teacher and chef and coach and mental health clinician to these kids. And I think that's really difficult. And I think we all recognize that that is going to create more disparity among these individuals who have these heightened medical and mental health comorbidities. So I think I summarize it as really trauma on top of trauma. And I think that's what Leslie was saying as well.
Taylor, can I add one thing about visitation?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, and I see there's a couple questions that relate to this. In California in particular, we have an emergency rule that was issued on April 6th, which actually sought to undo some of the immediate orders that had been made back in March that suspended visitation completely. And the emergency rule is that every child is to have an individualized assessment of the risk presented by COVID and balance that against the risk presented or the detriment to the child if visitation is suspended, and that it actually can't be completely suspended without a court order. The social worker does have the authority to modify the manner of visitation, so changing it from in-person to virtual, for example, or having it be in-person but under the guidelines of social distancing and proper hygiene, et cetera, which is difficult, of course, which the impact of that varies based on age, but certainly a school-age child or a teenager can still potentially have a face-to-face visit as long as all of the proper precautions are taken in terms of physical distancing, mask and gloves, et cetera, but they could sit outdoors with their parent and have a conversation or with their siblings. There are things that can still happen. So I do not want to give the false impression that all visits are suspended in California. They are not. And the law is still requiring us to do an individualized assessment. And there is some recourse if one party or another feels that the individualized assessment and the change in the manner was not appropriate for that family.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm wondering how you might respond to some of the concerns that Dr. Barron raised as well around difficulty accessing healthcare, perhaps difficulty participating in reunification services that might be required as a part of the case plan, and what can be done today, and if anything, and what we might be thinking about for the future if the pandemic comes to an end.
Sure. So those concerns are very real and similar to what Stacey mentioned in terms of privacy in a telehealth situation. We have the same concerns for attorneys speaking with their clients using telephone or video conferencing. We're never 100% certain whether the client is alone or whether they feel comfortable talking about things that are typically privileged, just like with a doctor, a client and a child and their attorney have a privileged relationship, and that's central to our advocacy. So there is definitely a reduction in our level of confidence with regard to what we're hearing from our clients because we can't sit in a room with them and because we're not face to face. And we are still doing a very small number of client interviews face to face, but it is probably less than a tenth because of our desire to be good citizens and flatten the curve and keep everybody safe. So that is a real concern on the legal side as well. And in terms of what you just talked about in terms of services and case plans, the vast majority of services that have been ordered in case plans are currently unavailable, which means that children aren't getting the services they need. Some mental health is being provided, again, over the video or telephone, but not to the degree that it was being offered prior to the pandemic. Parents are having an extremely difficult time accessing services. There's a small number of substance abuse services that are being offered by telephone or video, and a few programs are doing one-on-one meetings. But for the most part, services are put on hold, and similar to young people, parents who don't have access to technology are cut off from even what is available through services. The federal government did just on Saturday release a letter, I think it was last Saturday, release some guidance indicating that 4E funds can now be used to help parents with technology as well as children, but that we haven't seen the impact of that yet, and it will take some time for our clients, the parent clients, to benefit from that. But so in addition to just the inability to comply with the case plan on a day-by-day basis, the other, and I think perhaps even more significant concern, is individuals who may regress due to the lack of services. We're going to have folks who have been clean and sober for a long time, for many, many months, and have been progressing well in their recovery, who may now fall off the wagon, or may use again, or develop a new set of challenges because of the pandemic, because of changes in their circumstances, because of anxiety that we're all feeling, and they may have fewer coping strategies available to them and fewer supports and being cut off from their kids. So all of the stressors that we can think of are all being compounded by that. So we're very concerned about parents and children regressing in their own well-being and that interfering with their reunification plan. For the youngest children, the interruption in attachment and the inability to form strong attachments is probably the number one concern. And unfortunately, the solution that's been presented has been, well, we'll give people more time down the road. We can extend reunification services. We can lengthen the time allowable to determine if a family can be reunified. And while that may help, it can't undo the damage that happens when that early attachment is severed. And we aren't going to know how that's going to impact children for many years down the road. When we see things emerge as they are when they're toddlers or when they're school age and they develop new challenges and different challenges, or the parent who's complied with the case plan doesn't have that primary attachment or bonding to their child, we may see that surface in very damaging ways down the road that may or may not ever be linked back to COVID, but we need to plan for it now. And what I think that means and what we're hoping to see, and I may be somewhat jumping ahead to one of the other questions, is that we have to rethink services and rethink case plans so that the case plan and the services that are provided when shelter in place is lifted directly address the damage that's been done now, rather than just business as usual. Okay, we're up and running, go back to your programs, go back to your counseling, and we'll keep on progressing along. But we may have to really rethink the case plan, what I like to refer to as the kitchen sink case plan. This might be our opportunity to throw that out the window and actually develop targeted services that can address the specific trauma, the specific situation of that family, so that we can get them back on track and give them the tools they need to strengthen the attachment and the bonding and to deal with whatever their additional presenting issues were when they came into our system.
Thank you, Leslie. Stacey, any thoughts on that before we move on to our next question?
Just to say that I very much agree, and I think probably a nature of like our long-term implications is really going to be this flexibility and taking a look at everything that we do now, knowing that COVID is now part of our history and is going to be part of that family history, and figuring out how within each of our spheres we can pivot and be flexible. We might have used to do something in a certain way, and this pandemic has caused us to rethink, to maybe take some positives from some new changes and to reevaluate how we do what we were doing before. So just to reiterate the importance of it, I think being flexible and pivoting.
Great. So our next question was really about the long term, and we've talked a little bit about some of the impacts that our families will see. But I'm wondering if, from a legal perspective, Leslie, if you can talk briefly about what we can expect with respect to the courts when things really open up again, and how the courts might be impacted long term, and what we can be doing to proactively address some of those issues.
That's a great question, and it will vary county by county here in California. Right now, different counties are handling workload differently. So in some, they're doing the bare minimum, which is just emergency hearings, new cases, detentions, and that's it. In others, they're running almost a full calendar. So they're virtually and using Zoom or similar platforms so that they can continue to do most of their cases. So for those folks, it won't be as different. So I'll focus on the places like Los Angeles, where we're doing very little right now. And one big difference is going to be, of course, workload. There's going to be an incredible backlog. We will have March, April, May, June, 4 months of cases that were continued to future dates. And when we return, which right now is tentatively June 22nd, is when the courts are anticipating reopening. It's not for certain, but that's the projected date. There's no plan for it to be business as usual. The plan is very gradual, just like we've heard about in terms of the community and restaurants and out in the public. The plan is a very gradual ramping up so that we don't see another spike in COVID, right, within weeks of returning back to work. So the continuing on with prioritized hearings and only doing the hearings that the court perceives to be the most important in the first few weeks, which on its face seemed like a good idea, but there are a lot of concerns now about what is happening to the families who are lingering and pushing their dates out even farther before they can get into court, and just the time needed to catch up on visits. And I'll use CLC as an example. We represent 30,000 children here in Los Angeles and have over 100 social work investigators that work for CLC who spend every day, all day out in the community visiting children. They have not been able to do that. They're doing most of it by telephone and by video, but that's not enough for us to feel comfortable and confident. So all of those virtual contacts will have to be redone in person when we have when shelter in place is lifted and when we have the opportunity to do that. So I think the workload piece is tremendous. And the more that we can do now, while we are sheltered in place with stipulated orders and agreements and doing things virtually, the better position we'll be in when shelter in place is lifted to get back to work and to meet the needs of the families that need us the most. And again, as we talked about with changing case plans, I think I'm hopeful that it won't be business as usual when we return, and that instead we will be much more targeted and really take a minute to look at every single family and figure out exactly what they need from us so that we can meet those needs in the most expeditious and throwaway possible. You know, for many, many years, we've talked about a child's timeline and how a child's timeline is different than an adult timeline. And the courts have always been guided by this principle that we have to do things quickly and that we have to recognize that for a child, a day may feel like a year. Because they don't have that same sense of time, especially the younger that they are. And if they don't see their parents for a few days, in their heart, it feels like forever, right? And so, we can't abandon that principle because of COVID. And I think to some degree, the fear that the pandemic has instilled has caused us to forget or to not give enough attention to the things that are tried and true in terms of how we should be serving families. So we do need to get back to those core principles of looking at all of our work from the child's perspective and on a child's timeline. And that we have to remember that everything is urgent for these families and for children, and do everything that we can to provide them with as much service and with access to the courts as is possible.
Thank you. Stacey, any thoughts, particularly on some of the social determinants issues that come up in your clinic with caregivers reporting job loss and difficulty paying bills and difficulty supporting the children that they have in their home that we've talked about in the last week?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts on that. I think first to just tie into what has been said, you know, in the legal system, we're seeing this back up. We're going to have creative strategies to kind of get ahead. I think so too is there a parallel in our medical system that we are behind. We are going to be behind, and we need to figure out creative strategies to catch up. I'll talk about the trauma question that you asked, Taylor, first. So I think as a hub provider, we are sort of trained to approach all of our visits with a trauma lens, and we're doing so pre-COVID. So an awareness of adverse childhood experiences and social determinants of health was sort of part of every aspect of the history that I was taking before this pandemic. A conversation about obesity becomes very different when you have a background of abuse and food insecurity than when that is not present. And so I think so too, as we wove the trauma that our patients had into every part of our, what we call our history of present illness in medicine, so too are we going to be weaving COVID into our interval history and into our trauma-informed history, recognizing that this has, without a doubt, disrupted everyone's life to some extent. And I think we have to be ready that these kids and families that live with this background of trauma, this crisis can really exacerbate those already existing disparities, and we have to be ready to screen and respond to that. And I can't tell you how many families I've called over the past week, and I say, how are you? They say, we're great. We have our health. And then we get into more details. COVID has affected every family. How turns out they need food resources, they need clothing resources, they need housing assistance. And so really kind of diving into how this pandemic has been challenging for their family has helped me kind of link my patients to the appropriate ancillary services that they need. And I think to highlight that these issues that we're talking about with school, with finances, with therapy, stress has adverse health consequences and impacts management of general health, but also chronic diseases. So I think, we're going to need to prepare going forward that our patients with chronic diseases are going to come to us unmanaged, that vaccinations are going to be behind, and we're going to be working really hard to promote vaccines in a safe way this time so that we don't see a resurgence of vaccine preventable diseases, which will be another problem. We've had a huge lag in dental care, and our patients in the hub clinics have a higher rate of dental caries. So that's going to be an issue as well. And then I'll talk about sort of a general fear that I've sensed from my patients and from the public of seeking medical services. And I'm afraid that this is going to persist, and we're going to need to address that fear head on. Literally 15 minutes before this call, I was on the phone with a foster caregiver about this exact topic, about fear of bringing an infant who was turning blue into the hospital. And so these are caregivers who recognize that something is wrong with their child, but yet still are very fearful of what's going on with COVID and how to keep themselves safe. And so I found myself sort of explicitly telling families what we have done at our hospital to keep them safe, yet still provide them the very necessary care that they need. Kids with fractures cannot stay home. They need to be casted. They need to be seen. Medical conditions and medical events continue to happen that are not necessarily COVID related and need to be taken care of. And every health system and health facility, depending on their resources, has found strategies to do that. But I think making that explicit to the families so they know what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to be seen. And then I'll talk about a positive sort of for the long term. I think we've talked about sort of the drawbacks of telehealth and telemedicine. It has certainly been an adventure. I have had so many families that are just so thankful for the check-in, and the number of families that we can reach out to in this manner is a lot more. You overcome the different clinic flow issues. You also have patients that are not missing work, they're not missing school. Coming to clinic is takes up a pretty large part of the day and can be fairly disruptive. And so to be able to call and check in on things, how are you doing this week? Like, how did that one small thing go last week? They're really appreciative of those sorts of check-ins. And I think we need to do more of those, knowing that our community is in fear and they're struggling with some of these things. So I think those are my main, I think, in the long term, we're going to be coming up with these creative strategies to weave COVID into our history, screen for COVID related trauma, and then address unmet health needs that are probably going to be unmanaged.
Thank you, Leslie. Or thank you, Stacey. Leslie, I'm just wondering, in reference to things like the delays accessing dental care, the vaccinations, some of the issues that Stacey raised, do you think that there is a mechanism through the courts that can help increase access to all of those things once this ends?
That's a great question also. And I want to piggyback on what Stacey said as well about the advantages to the telehealth, or in our case, telelaw, I guess, which is that it will, I agree that it will be a positive augmentation to in-person contact. Mm-hmm. So if we're now seeing a client once a month and we can see them once a month in person and talk to them, or by video another time in that same month or twice in that same month, it strengthens relationships, it builds trust. And those check-ins, as you're talking about, I do think that we have learned from that, and that we will continue to use those tools post-pandemic as an augmentation to to our traditional practice. So I think that is a positive as well. And Taylor, with regard to accessing the healthcare services, I think it's it's something we are going to have to address. And off the top of my head, because I really have not thought about that until right now. I did not think about the vaccine issue at all, so thank you for that. There may be ways that we can have, like, now when we go to the pharmacy and can get our flu shot, maybe court is a place where there can be vaccine clinics. I don't know. It's not in my control, but certainly seems like a good idea. We have in the past had, we had a vision clinic one time where a mobile home that was equipped as a optometry office pulled up to the courthouse parking lot, and clients could go and get checked for vision and get glasses prescriptions right there on the spot. So something similar, if we can use the courthouse locations as mobile health sites for vaccinations and other things, that seems like a great idea, and maybe something that can be looked into in the future. I know the courts are very worried about an onslaught of people into the court buildings when the shelter in place is first lifted, and they intend to be very careful and very thoughtful about the flow of people into the courthouse. As anyone who's ever been to a children's courthouse in California knows, they tend to be very crowded, and people spend hours and hours and hours waiting, very similar to a clinic situation. And we need to develop a new approach to prevent that from happening until we do have a complete handle on COVID, until we have vaccinations and treatment, which we all know is probably sometime down the road. It won't be right when shelter in place is lifted. So there'll be challenges there, but it's definitely an important thing for us to be thinking about, and certainly something that the courts and child welfare should be adding to our checklists of things we're checking in with clients about, to make sure that they are current on vaccinations and that they have access to the best information from the medical community so that they're accessing the medical services that they need in a way that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, thank you both. I think I have like many little wheels turning in my head right now. I'm sure Stacey does too, about mobile services that could be provided through the courts. Like you said, perhaps in the parking lot in partnership, perhaps with our hub system, UCLA, et cetera. So I think we'll have to put our heads together on that and be thinking to the future. Leslie, this wasn't on the question list, but I trust you can speak to it. Governor Newsom announced $42 million invested for children and families last week, I believe. Can you speak to that a little bit and what that actually means for our LA County system as well as systems statewide?
I will try. I don't have my fact sheet in front of me, but I will try. And if any of my people are listening and they want to text me, feel free. So
I don't put you on the spot, but I have confidence in you, Leslie.
So yes, the governor did announce a series of budget items that put a whole bunch of more money into are intended to put money into the hands of children and families. So for example, probably some of the most powerful pieces for us are our older clients, the non-minor dependents, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds will not have to have face-to-face interviews or the traditional series of hoops they have to jump through to be eligible to receive additional financial support. So there should be fewer interruptions in financial support for the older youth and easier access to that financial support if they have to change residence. They've been, as we've said, they've left their dorms, they've lost their job, whatever their situation might be. A lot of what went along with the financial incentives were policy changes, and one or the other doesn't work by itself. So right when the governor issued his order, at the same time, the California Department of Social Services issued a whole slew of ACINs, which direct the counties on how to implement the budget changes. So one is the reducing the restrictions or the requirements to access services and funds. Another very significant one is that $1.7 million was put into the budget to allow support payments to continue to youth who would be turning 21 after they turn 21. So we won't be terminating jurisdiction. Typically, as soon as the 21st birthday comes, there are no more supports available from the foster care system. Through the end of this fiscal year, that's all on hold. So a child that turns 21 today or tomorrow can continue to receive support and have their case be held open at least until June 30th. All of these budget items go through June 30th because it's the current fiscal year. We expect that there will probably be additional extensions or additional funds in the new fiscal year, but that has not been released yet. There are cash incentive or cash payments available to foster families, relative families, and birth parents. I believe it's $200 a family to help them get through an immediate crisis. There's $300,000 for technology. So that goes back to what we talked about and making sure that children and parents and foster homes have access to the internet, have computers necessary for kids to do their online schooling, to access their tele and mental health services, medical and mental health services, and to have those virtual visits that we've been talking about. There's also an ability for counties to increase the rate paid to foster homes so that they can continue to care for children who might be sick, or if they themselves become sick, or there are other pressures on their family in terms of maintaining foster care placements or relative care placements. Counties have flexibility now to increase the monthly stipend that's provided to cover any unexpected expenses or help that the family needs to keep placement stable so that children won't have to be replaced due to COVID or to other pressures on a particular family. Those are the highlights that are jumping out at me. Are there any other in particular that you were thinking of that you'd like me to speak to?
No, the one that I was most curious about is with respect to caregiver support, because I think that's something that is really standing out in the minds of a lot of folks, as well as how the older youth are being supported with additional resources, and potentially how some resources are flowing into the family resource centers with the idea that we can aid in prevention with the family resource center as a site for support.
Yes, so those resource centers did get an influx of cash as well to be able to provide additional supportive services out in the community to foster families and birth families.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Stacey, I think, had an update on vaccines and also wanted to talk about how she's checking in with patients, just as a quick aside.
Yeah, great. So just to add to the creativity around vaccinations, I think we're having ongoing calls about how to do this, including opening up some drive-through vaccine appointments so that the nurse is just going out into the car. We have adjusted, and again, every clinic has done this, has pivoted in their own way, depending on their resources and their patients and their capacity for staff. We are still seeing initial health assessments in person. We are still seeing forensic evaluations in person. We are still seeing SART exams when necessary in person. And so we are still having in-person touch points with kids who are newly detained into kinship or foster care. And then for all of our other sort of continuity patients, we are switching to phone visits depending on the age of the patient. And then we're also actively taking calls and managing calls from families and making sure that they're understanding how to sort of navigate the health system in this changing time, what needs to be seen, what can wait at home, things like that. So we've really kind of changed the whole clinic flow. And I think I encourage everyone to talk to their local clinic and understand what they're doing. But for the hub clinics, we continue to see newly detained children in person for those visits.
Stacey, can you drop the hotline that you mentioned that VIP is operating?
Yes.
Into the chat, or if you know it off the top of your head?
Yeah, so LAC USC has created this amazing call line 24/7. It's at the VIP clinic there, and it's staffed to answer questions about COVID-related matters coming from social workers or parents, etc. Their phone number is 323-409-3090, and I can put that in the chat as well. I think our department is also helping public health too, and there's like questions that come up every day that no one has experienced before, and I think it's just so helpful to have a resource to reach out to. So I do encourage folks who have questions from DCFS to call, and that for families to call their provider when they have a medical question, so to really work out what is appropriate to stay home and what really needs to be seen, and what has your clinic done to keep you safe when you are being seen.
Great, thank you so much. We've heard a lot about the schools being a hub for resources for children and families with respect to information about unemployment or the stimulus checks or reading to your children, food, etc. And I wonder, Leslie, do you imagine that in a post-COVID era that the courts might be similarly situated to serve as that kind of resource hub for children and families involved with the foster care system?
So the courts already, at least in LA County, we do, and in many counties, do serve as hubs for resources in those ways. There are quite a few organizations that are co-located within many of our dependency courthouses. We have had eligibility workers and substance abuse programs and school districts that have had staff on site, grandparents as parents, many different organizations that do provide services from the courthouse. There's unfortunately, some of it just relates to bricks and mortar. We are bursting at the seams in LA County. In our children's courthouses, there's nowhere to put another person. So part of it is a restriction based on physical structure and availability of space. One of the, we've worked so hard to reduce caseloads by opening more courtrooms and by hiring more and more staff, but that also means that there's more bodies in the courthouse and every inch of space is sort of used up. So in terms of physical programs at the courthouse, I think it really is going to be in large part impacted by the space that's available. In terms of access to virtual services, though, of course, and referrals for those services, absolutely. We do have 211 in our courthouses now, which is a great place to go to get resources and information. For children who are coming in through the shelter care, the Department of Children and Family Services brings in a whole array of services into that space so that young people can have talks with all different sorts of service providers. They have enrichment activities as well. The zoo brings animals and snakes and reptiles every now and again. So some of it is fun and some of it is related to their very specific service needs. There's a public health nurse on site at all times at the courthouse in Los Angeles. So it varies. And I think we're always looking for ways to get folks connected to services because we know that the day you come to court is a great opportunity because it's when people feel the most sense of urgency to really get connected. And as soon as they leave us, we lose some folks, we lose their attention or that energy or enthusiasm that might be present the day that they're in the courthouse.
Great, thank you so much. We've talked a little bit about policy recommendations, but wondering if either of you have any additional suggestions, things that might need to be legislated, local action that perhaps Board of Supervisors may consider taking to address some of the concerns or issues that have been raised today.
So I think one of the first things is taking advantage of the federal changes and of the state changes. Just because they're written on a piece of paper doesn't mean they're happening. So with regard to the Board of Supervisors, taking advantage of the fact that 4E money can be used to help families access technology, I would put very high on the list because that is a huge problem. And we don't have a route to using those funds yet. We just know that they're available out there and we need to be nimble and quick to get that out there. I think what I mentioned before about child's time should control everything that we do. And all of our decisions need to be made in that context and to not let ourselves be controlled by fear. Doing as much as we can now and doing as much as we can virtually, again, I think is a very important step to be taken. We need ways, and the technology piece is not just for families. We need to make sure that social workers and court clerks and administration who are telecommuting have access to the technology they need to do their jobs. The court calendars are not running at full capacity, and one of the reasons is because of the lack of people power to do their jobs. And some folks can't work because they're caring for children, caring for family members, et cetera, but there are a large number who could be working if they had more connectivity and if they had more leeway in how to do their jobs differently so that they can continue to be productive and help our cases move along. So those are the policy changes that I would say that we're looking for right now.
Great, thank you. Stacey, I'm wondering, health systems wise, any suggestions specifically for our kids in care?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first, this is, like I said before, a public health crisis requires a mindset of epidemiology and disease spread and crafting the response. And this is an actively, daily, minute by minute changing situation that requires flexibility. So I think the goal for all of us is to create the most minimal burden on families from a health and mental health standpoint. But at this point, the priority is health and flattening the curve. And I think we all know that our actions and decisions, even if temporary, are going to have consequences. So to be honest about those, to prepare for those as a system is important. And to that end, forums like this, so engaging with academic, county systems, schools, Department of Public Health, mental health, we need the forums, Taylor, that you've set up for us here, which is amazing because I feel like the resources that come at us every day are just numerous, and it's really important to sort of share our experience that will allow us to support our community to the best of our ability. And I also think we need to develop robust ways to engage with our families, to check in with our families, and to assess the youth and family perspective. And develop strategies to meet those needs. So whether it be, partnering like with the courts, as Leslie said, to do certain services, or piggybacking on the grab and go food stations to the schools, just find creative strategies to do things that we used to do more easily. And I think that sort of summarizes, it comes under the theme of collaboration and communication and organization.
Great. Thank you. So as everybody knows, UCLA is a public university. I'm here to serve in large part the residents of the state of California, and that includes our children. Wondering if either of you have any suggestions specifically on how UCLA can be a resource during this time, and suggestions for us at UCLA Pritzker Center on what we can do to aid you in that mission of urging the university to continue to be a partner to all Californians, including children, during this time.
So I would say forums like this, sharing information, the connections that are made cross disciplines are extremely helpful. Just this point today about vaccines was not something I had thought about as an attorney, but I am responsible for 33,000 children in one way. So I think these opportunities to share, whether it's in a webinar like this, or in smaller groups, or virtually, or just through information sharing, is extremely helpful. We, as Taylor knows, CLC is entering into a new program with UCLA where we're going to have post-bar law clerks coming from the law school. And the more resources we have and people just boots on the ground doing the work, the better. So we're very excited about that partnership. I think the research piece is extremely important. What Stacey mentioned a few times about COVID now becoming part of a person's history. We need to hear from the academics. The practitioners need to hear from the academics on what they're learning about the experience of our families over these few months and going into the future, and what we should be asking for, and what services we can be providing to them, or what strategies or interventions that we can provide or ensure that those connections are made. So the more that comes out of academia giving us your best thinking, the better for those of us who are in the courtrooms every day, because our advocacy is only as good as what we've learned, both from our clients and from research. So I think we need both of those things in order to make the best arguments and advocate for our clients the best that we can. Access to services, making sure that there are mental health and health services available for our clients. And then I think this is not new, but it's a constant need, is for mentors and folks to serve as a holder of education rights for a child, and individual advocates for children, someone that can just be there to be Another support in that child's life is extremely important. With regard to education rights holders, we always have a need for that. So feel free to reach out to us on our website if you'd like to volunteer. And I would say college students make great ed rights holders, as do parents, and anyone can serve as an education rights holder. You don't need special training. We provide the training. You don't need to come to us with special training. And it's a really important role to make sure that children are getting what they need educationally. And then last, and this applies across the universe, not just to UCLA, but families are in grave need right now, and every kind of donation is necessary. Diapers are so expensive, right? And young people who can't pay their rent just need money to pay their rent. So any type of donation, whether it's of your time, time, talent, and energy, as we talk about, or time, treasure, and talent, all of those things. So there are many, many ways to get involved, and a lot of resources. And I know we had a resource question. I'll just throw it out now so that you don't have to come back to me since we're running out of time. From a legal perspective, the National Association of Counsel for Children, the Family Justice Initiative, and the American Bar Association all have resource pages on their websites specific to COVID. And the NACC page in particular has a California section as well as their national section. So for the lawyers or those looking for legal resources, those are the places that I would send you. Thanks.
Leslie, thank you. You said NACC, Family Justice, and ABA. Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Stacey, any thoughts on that? Last question.
So many thoughts. Have a number of resources. I agree with partnering with the schools, with students, with the Guardian Scholars Program. I think it's so important to assess the youth who have had experiences in foster care and what we can learn from that. So just more collaboration with the student groups, I think, would be great. And I agree with Leslie about the donations. We're finding creative ways to have diapers and formula available when we're doing newborn visits and our initial health assessments. And I've given out those on a daily basis. And then, yeah, that's about it. I agree with everything else she said. I know we're running low on time.
No, so I want to thank both of you so much. I think, one of our primary goals at the UCLA Pritzker Center is to bring together multiple disciplines to have conversations about issues impacting children and families. And I certainly feel that we did that here today by bringing together the Children's Law Center of California, leading force in advocacy for children across the country, but specifically here in California with respect to their legal rights. And certainly hearing from our hub doctors is always valuable. We all appreciate that the hub system is really unique to LA County and does things for our kids in care that many health systems otherwise could not. So it was incredibly helpful to hear from both of you. In closing, to all of our attendees today, we had, at one point, it was over 250 people joining us for this discussion. We will share resources and suggestions that came up today in a forthcoming newsletter, which we'll be sending to all of our attendees. So any questions that you had about resources or phone numbers or things like that that were shared, we will be sure to send to all of you. And in the meantime, if you have additional questions, you are welcome to reach out to us. And please find all of our talks, recordings available on Twitter, our YouTube page, and on Facebook. I really want to thank our speakers. Let's give Stacey and Leslie a round of applause virtually for their incredible contributions today. And we really thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all. Have a great day.